Hello everyone, welcome back. So in the last lesson we have added the forget password component. So now we have the login, new account, forget password, components implemented, which is good. The next step is that after we log in, right? For example, we should have a shopping cart, my profile book, listed. And for my profile path, take an example from my other course. And we have the, user information, right? Orders, billing, shipping, the tabs the user has logged in, okay? So we're gonna add my profile. Starting to add it because it's gonna take probably a couple of lessons to finish that because we have several tabs to finish. We don't have this view implemented yet. We're gonna implement just edit, order, billing, shipping. Okay. So let's open our terminal and go to our components folder and a new component called my profile. So a quick side note is that, as you can see from our not this one. So when we click on my account, we have 3 tabs, right? And those 3 tabs actually they're residing in the same component. So this is actually not very good because you want to separate components into reasonable size. Because right now, if you look at our micron component, this is not very long, which is still acceptable, and it's HTML, it's okay. But when it grows bigger, when you look at each component, when it has more content, you want to make sure that it's reasonable size. So if it's get more complicated, it's better that you separate those 3 tabs into 3 different components, which is actually supported by the Angular material. So for example, at the bottom here we have the tabs and navigation. We can have this route outlet to provide a route. So the tab nav is not tied to any particular router. It works with normal, ampersand elements and uses the active property to determine which tab is current. The corresponding router outlet can be placed anywhere in the view. Okay, that means it's possible that you can provide different components and use the router to configure that. But I'm not doing it in this lesson yet. I just leave you guys have this option, and it better in your mind. Okay. And then let's come back to our my profile. We're gonna start to develop something here. Actually, it's gonna take a little bit of space to develop because we have a bunch of tabs. But anyway, let's first try to add it. The first one is import what do we do? App constant from constants app constants, and we're gonna define a private server path app const server path, and also we're gonna define another variable data fetched as false, login error boolean, so that would be false. Private login boolean, and private credential, and this would be username, password. Okay. And also we're gonna create a user equals to new user, and we're gonna do an update success, new password, string, incorrect password, boolean. All right. So we're gonna import some services as well. We're gonna have our user service services user.service, and we're gonna import login service services login.service, and we're gonna import the user model as well. Okay. For those services, we're gonna define an instance. Login service, oops, comma, and then we have user service. Okay. And next, we're gonna start to define a method called update user info, and we're gonna use the user service dot update user info, this dot user, this dot new password, subscribe, res console.log. We're gonna have the response update success equals to true, error console.log, error.text, let error message equals to error.text, if error message equals to incorrect parent password, this the incorrect password equals to true. Okay, so basically we are calling this user service that update user information, so that when we come to, let's try to log in again. When we come to this edit user information page, we basically just pass in the user information plus the new password. Okay, so this is the old password, this is a new password, to this method, this service method. And then we're gonna write this service method to send the user information and the new password to the backend. So first of all, the backend is gonna check whether the current password is correct or not. If it's correct, the user information will be updated. If it's not correct, the system will not update user information and they send a feedback saying there's some error, and the error message would be incorrect current password. Okay. So let's go ahead and define this update user info method in the user service. So here we're gonna say update user info. User new password. Sorry, there should be RPU. New password string, and we have the URL equals to this dot server have plus user update user info, and that user info equals to ID user ID first name user the first name last name user the last name username user that username and current password user that password and email email user that email and new password okay, and we have a header or token header equals new headers content type application JSON XAuth token local storage that get item XAuth token. But basically this is for authorization using header. We're gonna have the URL post JSON.stringify, the user info, and then we're gonna just get the headers and token header. Okay, so that's basically our user update user information mapper. And we have this user service to call that. Now that we have the component, the next thing is we're going to implement the HTML, right? But that's going to be in the next lesson, all right? So we're going to continue in the next lesson. See you guys, bye.